Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize the Indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples of the Wampanoag Tribal Confederation territories, who both past and present and throughout many generations have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library is today. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled Indigenous land. I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute and AT&T, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore the latest developments in the crisis in Ukraine with our distinguished guests this evening. I am now delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. We are so glad to welcome Fredrik Logevall back to the Kennedy Library virtually. He is the Lawrence D. Belfer Professor of International Affairs and Professor of History at Harvard University. He is the author or editor of 10 books, including Embers of War, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History. His newest book is JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956. I'm so pleased to extend a virtual warm welcome back to the Kennedy Library to Tom Nichols, who is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and just completed 25 years of teaching at the US Naval War College. His most recent book is Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. I'm also delighted to welcome back to the library virtually our moderator for this evening, Alexandra Vacroux, who is Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Her scholarly work addresses many Russian and Eurasian policy issues. Before joining the Davis Center, she held a variety of scholarly and business positions in Washington, DC, and Moscow. Please join me in welcoming our special guests. And over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this very important conversation on the war in Ukraine. Now, unfortunately, an hour and a half is not enough to do justice to all of the topics we could address, all of the topics we should address, but we're going to do our best to cover as much as possible in the hour of moderated conversation and then in the Q&A that follows. In order to try and wrestle these topics into some kind of organizational structure, I'm going to focus 15 minutes roughly on each of the four topics. The first, we'll start with where things stand in Ukraine at present. We'll move on to whether or not this is an entire conflict of Putin's making or whether there are other issues to take into account. Then we'll go on to what the US and NATO should be doing. And in the last 15 minutes, we'll ask our panelists, Fred and Tom, what they're going to be looking for in the coming weeks. So let me start by where things stand in Ukraine at present. Of course, we're all doom scrolling as often as we can to find out what's happening on the ground on a minute-by-minute basis. But we're so fortunate to have a political scientist and a historian here to help us take a slightly broader lens and make sense of what's happening. And I want to start with you, Tom. As a professor of international relations, help us understand what went wrong here, how we ended up watching a European democracy get pulverized by Russia.
Well, thank you for having me to the JFK Library, and it's an honor to be with all of you on the panel. I think, you know, there's the deep context view where people will argue that this has been brewing for anywhere from 20 to 1,000 years. And there is some of that we need to think about in terms of the way the Soviet Union fell, for example, and the way those borders were left in 1991. So I'll say a few words about that very quickly. But I do think that when we're asking the question, why are we looking at this now? The answer is very much about this particular regime in Moscow. So the overall answer about why there are tensions between Russia and Ukraine at all is that a lot of this is an artifact of the fall of the Soviet Union, which had internal borders. I've written about this and I've called it Stalin's revenge. These internal borders were specifically designed to prevent what happened in 1991. They were specifically designed to prevent the Soviet Union from coming apart. And they ran borders through areas internal borders through areas that were areas of shared linguistic or ethnic identity, and specifically split them up so that if those ever became independent areas, they would, as we've seen throughout the former Soviet Union for 30 years, that those would erupt into violence. You saw it in Georgia, you see it in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Soviet map makers intentionally created parts of the Soviet Union where these republics and autonomous areas were discontiguous, trapping people into what would be irredentia almost immediately if the Soviet Union ever broke up. And nobody had to care much about those borders because, of course, everything was moved and administered from Moscow. That can only get you so far, though, in explaining things like why was there so much conflict over Crimea? Could we have averted some of this by fostering some kind of dialogue or negotiation between Crimea and Russia 30 years ago? Maybe. But the bigger problem was, I think, and this is my bias as a political scientist looking at regimes rather than leave it to Fred to talk about the history. I think that a lot has to do with the failure of democracy, a project about which I was pretty optimistic in the 90s, and the emergence of essentially a mafia regime. And I think also there's the issue of contingency over the past few years. So you have a regime led basically by gangsters at this point, who rely on deals among themselves, just like kind of like if you've seen The Godfather, then you understand a lot about how Russia works. But also there is this problem that the Don, the boss of all bosses, Putin, has some pretty definite ideas about how the whole territory should look. And I don't think he came into office with those. I mean, the political scientists and criminologists argue a lot about, was Putin always like this? Did he change? You can go back to 2007 and find interviews where Putin says it's ridiculous to think about trying to impose new systems or constitutions on former Soviet republics. We can't take them over. It doesn't work that way. That's not the way the world is anymore. And 15 years later, here we are, where this almost mystical, messianic kind of really unhinged talk. I mean, the past 2 or 3 speeches Putin has given are really weird in a lot of ways. And I think part of what's going on may be the contingency of the pandemic itself. Putin's circle has gotten narrower and narrower and smaller. And I want to draw attention to one aspect of this conflict that we're not thinking about enough in the West, and that is the role of religion and the Russian Orthodox Church. Some of the people closest to Putin are very conservative clergy. The patriarch of the Russian Church supports this. And I say this, I have to issue a personal disclaimer here. This is not about how I feel about religion, because I'm actually an Eastern Orthodox Christian. So I'm actually an Orthodox believer. This is a huge schism in the Orthodox world. But Putin, I think, has been, in the past 2 years of isolation, has been increasingly relying, living in his own head and relying on these kind of mythic stories of, you're going to be the guy that reunites Russia with the little people, the little brothers of Ukraine. You're going to restore the Orthodox faith. You will be the greatest leader in Russian history. So while there's all of these historical circumstances that were the raw material for this kind of conflict, I think the reason that we're living through this nightmare right now is a combination of bad Western policies over the past 10 years. I think if we had been a lot firmer in opposing the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, we might not be here today. But I think counterfactual blaming only gets us so far. But I think the use of chemical weapons in Syria, a lot of other things where the Americans just kind of detached themselves from what was going on in the world, that I think Putin took notice of. But I also think, and I wonder my colleague Ann Applebaum is right at the Atlantic, who said, this may be one of the weirdest unintended consequences of the pandemic isolation, that this guy has basically been, in a bunker for 2 years because he's terrified of getting COVID. So I think we had a perfect storm of terrible things coming together. And the final point, then I'll stop, is that the thing I think that led Putin into this, and that is now explaining a lot of the savagery of this war, is that he and his advisors made a gigantic strategic miscalculation. This will go down in history as one of the really great bungles and intelligence failures in modern history, because I think he was sold on the idea of a 4-day war, that this was going to go, he was going to go in, the Ukrainians were going to surrender, Zelensky was going to flee the country. I thought that was going to happen. I could not have guessed, as somebody studying the Russian military for 25 years, that they would be this incompetent and this poorly led and poorly exercised. But when it didn't happen, I think rage and humiliation took over. Now, I think if you had told Putin 6 months ago, look, this will be a bloody struggle, we will lose thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, he might have been deterred from thinking about it. But I think he, as is always the case in autocratic systems, I think his yes men said, yep, we can do this. And it'll take 5 days, and Zelensky will go to, Vienna, and Ukraine will become part of the Russian, in some way, become part of the Russian Federation. So there's a lot there, but that's my kind of immediate how we got here explanation of this so far.
All right, I think you've touched on every topic we're going to talk about today. So that was a great introduction. But one of the things you said was about issues going down in history, and that's the perfect segue for Fred. Fred, as a historian, help us put this current moment into a historical perspective. Is this a unique moment, a unique catastrophe, or is this something that we've seen before?
I think it's substantially unique. We're trained as historians to say that there's nothing new under the sun. We're also trained as historians to always look for patterns, and I think those are there. And I hope we can get into this. I think my short answer to that question, Alexandra, is that there are many aspects of this that I think, at least in modern history, I think are at least hard for me to find, analogs for. Tom has said a couple things that I think are just really interesting. I just want to come back to those. Mm-hmm. It's quite true about Putin. Lots of interviews that are easy to find in which he says that, the intervention in Czechoslovakia was a mistake in '68. That Hungary 56 was a mistake. Now we could, I suppose, debate whether even at the time really reflected his view. But I think Tom is right to say that there is a different Putin over the last few months, and this notion, this Ann Applebaum notion, that perhaps the pandemic helps to explain this, I think it has power. I think there's something to this. And I guess, Alexandra, that brings me to a second point that I would make with respect to the history. Interesting distinction to be made, it seems to me, and an important one, between Putin today and Nikita Khrushchev in October of 1962. Everybody knows, of course, that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. Maybe we'll talk more about that. But I was thinking about this, that the difference as I see it is that Khrushchev, for all of his bluster, all of his tendency to gamble, he backed down. He did it not just in the missile crisis in October of '62. There are other times during his tenure in which he backed down when he felt that he needed to. He was a rational actor in the end. He could see that the Americans were superior in all kinds of ways, and he wasn't going to risk. He wasn't going to risk, nuclear annihilation as a result. The other thing that's interesting about, and it goes to Tom's point about him having a smaller and smaller circle, is Khrushchev at least had to pay some attention to the Politburo, or as it was called then, the Presidium. He had to pay attention, that is to say, to the people around him, fellow officials, It's true he was first among equals. He made the decisions, but there was to a degree at least a kind of collective, as Tom is suggesting here. There's very little evidence that that's going on. It's a few yes men, as Tom said, and I think that's an important difference, and it has me very concerned about where we are now. And then, I was thinking about this with respect to Zelensky, and I think that, we could have a counterfactual here. And this is something that I think, as Tom suggested, Putin did not count on. If Zelensky had done what Ghani did in Kabul, that is to say, flee the country, leave the country when things got really heated, where would we be? I don't know, but I do think we'd be in a very different place. So Putin is obviously key here, but also Zelensky's response, the Ukrainian response, this was not something they anticipated. Last thing I'll say is that I do think, and here again, I think I'm agreeing with Tom, that from Putin's perspective, if we try to see this from his point of view, I think he feels great resentment at how the Cold War ended. Feels that the West declared victory, that there was a kind of humiliation of Russia. By the way, he's not alone among Russians in feeling this. A kind of Western triumphalism that I think he found really problematic, to say the least. I think he also, of course, feels that Crimea, that Russia needs to have a sphere of influence, just like the Americans do. If they can have one, why can't I have one? And that from his perspective, that Ukraine needs to be within that sphere. So that recent historical evaluation of the situation, I think, really matters for him. And then the final point that I think matters here, that I'll end with this. I think he believed up until a month ago, and maybe rightly so, given the lack of a meaningful response to his Crimea invasion in 2014, after which he could strut around and say, mission accomplished. I think he felt that the West was weak, was not united. And as a result, in about 4 days, this thing will be accomplished. And, Zelensky will be off somewhere, keeping safe, and we will have accomplished what we set out to do. And boy, was he wrong about that.
So one of the interesting questions for me is we spend a lot of time thinking about what Putin might be feeling. What was the effect of COVID? Is he really isolated? Is that long table, more than a metaphor and actually evidence that he's not getting advice from anybody who's close to him? But I just remember a lot of conversations I had in Moscow, and the Russians love Kissinger, right? They love realism. They love talking about great powers and what great powers do. And I remember sort of the drumbeat of hearing that Europe was weak and fractured, right? That the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a sign that the US was finished and so weak that the Allies would never line up behind them again. And also that Ukraine was a domestic issue, right? And therefore there was very little analysis of what was happening inside Ukraine. And the Russians didn't think it really mattered, right? So there are these additional factors apart from Putin himself that seem to play into why there would be an invasion now, as opposed to 2 years ago or closer after Crimea, let's say Trump was in office and apparently rather docile. So it really makes us wonder about kind of the great man theory of history, right? And it was being debated even before Tolstoy talked about it in War and Peace. But is this Putin's miscalculation that's led us here, Fred? Is it a structural factor, or is it the man himself that account for where we are now? It sounds like you guys are saying it's the man himself.
I think it is substantially the man himself. As you point out, historians have long debated, individual human agency in history versus structural forces, which is greater, or as we might say, the great man theory of history. How much power does it actually have? And I think it's fair to say that professional historians over the last, 2-3 decades have gone much more in the direction of emphasizing structure, subterranean forces in history. I think have downplayed the role of individual human beings. I would argue too much so. I'm reminded as you were talking, Alexandra, about the classic Karl Marx quote that we all know: "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please." I mean, what he meant by that is that, yes, individuals matter, but leaders are also constrained. Even the most powerful leaders are constrained by forces beyond their control. And of course, I think that's what Putin is finding now. But I think, I don't know, I'll be interested to see what Tom thinks. But in my view, this is substantially about this regime and this leader. But as I suggested a moment ago, it goes also to this point about the great man. Zelensky, I think, matters enormously. Whatever happens after this, in a sense, I think Zelensky's place is secure. It's possible he'll make his own miscalculations and that, we're going to revise our view. But I think he has, in a sense, what he's done. Maybe I shouldn't make this analogy, but I'll make it. In a sense, he's done what Churchill did in 1940 in particular. Churchill gave Britain a leader that they didn't know they needed. I think Churchill gave the British people a sense of qualities that they didn't need, they had forgotten that they possessed. I think he's done the same. We might also note, and we should note, that Churchill made lots of strategic mistakes, tactical mistakes, lots of them. But at a key moment, he was there. And so, yeah, we could think about this both in terms of Putin's role in history here, but also Zelensky's.
Thank you, Fred. That's really important. And it's frustrating that we focus so much on Putin because he is the aggressor here and he's the one who invaded. But in fact, Zelensky's role is as important, or perhaps even more important, in how it's going to turn out. Tom, Fred has led me to the question that we've been asking ourselves definitely since the Obama administration, which is, when it comes to US-Russia relations, many people thought that we had a Putin problem, right? If only Putin weren't there, things would be so great. But do you think that's true? Is this a Putin problem, or is this a Russia in 2022 problem? I'm not saying because I want to get rid of Putin, but just like in general, like how much would that actually solve the problems that we're having now?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm going to agree with Fred here, Alexandra. I mean, let's do the counterfactual. I mean, or not even let's go back to the Yeltsin era. Amazingly, we had fights with Russia. We had differences. We had policy spats and all kinds of things that we didn't agree about in the world. We didn't have this. And there was, I wanted to pick up on something Fred said, because I think in a way particularly, I don't want to get too deep into academic epistemology, but there is a problem in the way that we're trained to think about this stuff. It is true that structure matters, but it usually matters on the things that are day-to-day issues. Now, he's a historian. I'm speaking as a political scientist, that the thing, that we can wash personalities out of a lot of decisions about ordinary relations like trade and security cooperation and peacetime and all that. But I think one of the things we learned, or should have learned, is that in moments of terrible crisis, personalities do matter. It does matter who's in the room. And I think too much of our scholarly approach over the years has been to try to wash all this out in the name of universalizable theories that will explain everything. And, sometimes you just have to have deep knowledge of the situation that you're looking at to make better decisions about it. And that that leads me to something you were saying about, people in Moscow talking about the West and, it's disunited and so on. It really strikes me that one thing we didn't think enough about with Putin, and I tried to bang this drum loudly for years, is how Soviet he is, and how culturally his most reliable supporters in Russia are Soviet era people who still believe this stuff. They say, see the West, they bicker with each other, and, you know, they have drag queens on Eurovision, and, you know, all of this stuff says, of course they would never stand up to us. And this was always a surprise. I mean, everything you were saying a moment ago, I was saying, this reminds me of being in the Soviet Union in the 80s when they were saying, you'd never stand up to us and you're all weak and you only care about your crazy rock and roll and your dope, and, you know, and it's, it really is, it is a throwback. And I think to understand the person you're dealing with, you have to understand that he comes out of that background. That, you know, I mean, he, even to this whole thing about that weird moment that I think a lot of Americans didn't understand, but if you remember the Soviet days, you get it completely. And he talks about eating your foie gras and having your gender fluidity, you know, like that's just such a Soviet thing of the days when I can remember Soviets telling me, well, you know, your army is full of drug addicts and homosexuals, as though that was like an explanation that the West would never be able. And I think Putin has, you know, internalized that because he is a savok, you know that he's a Soviet guy. He's a man of the system. And I think that interaction with the world before the past 2 years always kind of had to brace that back a bit in him. And now I think he's been living in a kind of time capsule where he really has come to believe all that stuff. Anyway, to get to your point about the Obama administration, yeah, I mean, I argued 20 years ago, give Putin a chance. He's doing some things, you know, when we were looking at the stuff he did when he first came into office, he was doing things that actually needed to be done. He was reforming the courts and rewriting the relations with treaties with the center and the federative subjects. You know, there was that first year or two, you looked and said, this, you know, this is pretty much like a normal leader. But I think by the time the Obama administration comes around, yeah, they were right to think there's a Putin problem. But I'm going to be very critical of the Obama administration because then they didn't manage that problem. And they said things out loud like, well, we're going to pivot to Asia. You know, we're going to, you know, we're that's old Europe and he's a man of the 19th century. That was not the way to deal with someone if you've decided that you have a Putin problem. And just today, you know, hours before we started this panel, apparently there was a Washington Post report that Biden personally, back in the day after Crimea, said we need to provide weapons. And Obama said, I don't want to, you know, I don't want to get stuck in that problem and escalate things with the Russians. And I think that was kind of a tendency of the Obama era that Putin thought was emblematic of just Western foreign policy in general, that we don't like complicated problems, we're disengaging from the world. And I think I don't want to lay too much of this on Barack Obama because I think his instincts not to wade into these hornets' nests, you know, had some merit to it. But if you've decided that you have a Putin problem and then your way of dealing with it is say, oh, he's just the sullen kid who sits in the back of the class, you have a mismatch in your foreign policy strategy.
I wonder if I can just come in briefly on that. I wonder if when the histories are written, Tom, and it's, you know, the good histories are probably a couple of decades away from this, but I wonder if Crimea in 2014 isn't going to loom as being really important, because as I suggested earlier, and it goes with what you're saying about the administration, about the Obama administration, that it seems to me that it was a kind of vindication for Putin that he could once again show that Russia was a great power. He could portray himself not just as a national leader, but as a kind of civilizational leader. And to go to your other point, he could say that this shows that the forces of, I don't know, traditional morality and Russian nationalism will prevail against the moral depravity of the West. And so maybe I'm attaching too much importance to Crimea 2014, but I think it's going to be a chapter, at least in the books when they're written about this.
You know, what's interesting is that you and I are talking about Crimea in 2014 and not really talking about Georgia in 2008. And I think we're right not to. I think, you know, the Georgians I mean, I'm not justifying what the Russians did. I think the Georgians bumbled into a Russian trap that was set for them. I think the Georgians misconstrued, whether the West would be there. And that whole thing became kind of a short, nasty business that lasts a few weeks. I don't really think that's the beginning. And I tend to agree with you that and of course, George Bush was still president. I think that the election of Barack Obama, I think there was a lot here culturally, having to treat a Black man as the equal of a Russian leader is something we haven't thought enough about as a motive here. They hated each other. Putin distinctly hated Obama in a way that he didn't feel about other American presidents, because there is a strong racist streak in Russian culture, I think, about this, but also that, there was this sense that Obama, I think, represented an America that had finally just said, we're just tired of you. You're not important enough to deal with. And I felt that very much myself when they flew bombers to Venezuela. I remember that was a big moment. Remember Alexandra, they flew, and someone said, "Tom, are you worried about this?" And I'm like, it's amazing they made it across the Atlantic. They must have been praying to, I can't think of their patron saint now, Fyodor, the admiral. They must have had icons on the control panel all the way across the Atlantic to get there. And I think, for Putin, that was that smarted. And I am not particularly moved by the arguments about Western triumphalism. I think that, if anything, what we're learning now in 2022 is that there were people in the Soviet Union who didn't understand well and truly that the Soviet system had been defeated, and they should have been made to feel that in some way more, in the way they were in other Eastern European regimes, where the Communist Party was sort of pushed out of public life. But I think with Putin, that feeling has grown as part of his own regime building, that it became, he's not just in office to provide a good life to Russians in a peaceful country. He really kind of absorbed the notion that a leader in the Kremlin must have a great crusade, and that crusade must always involve the West. And I think that's part of how we got here. And I think had there been some other leader in the Kremlin, I don't think we'd be here right now. And I think the proof of that is that we had we had Boris Yeltsin, we had Mikhail Gorbachev during the communist period. I mean, even people like Brezhnev and Andropov understood that there were some kind of limits on dealing with other countries in the world and the United States. And I think Putin has just been drinking his own hooch for too long now. And that makes him, I'm with Fred. I think this is extraordinarily dangerous because of that.
So explain to us then, Tom, the thesis behind your argument that you made in The Atlantic, right? That only NATO can save Putin now.
Well, this is Putin. The worst thing that can happen to Putin now is he's actually losing a war to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. This is, I think he would almost rather be able to rally his country and say, see, this was always about NATO. I told you it was about NATO. I told you the West was out to get us. It would allow him to squash whatever internal dissent is left. But more importantly, it would allow him to run roughshod over any dissent within the Kremlin about this misbegotten war. Because I think there are people, he's already arrested some of his own security people. Normally, you don't do that in the middle of a war. But I think he would be able to turn to other people in the Kremlin and say, now I can, whatever concerns you may have had about this completely, this adventure, now I demand your complete loyalty, because this is the war we've always prepared for. This is the war with NATO. And I almost think that he may think it's in his interest to try to draw the foul and involve NATO, so that if he has to sit down at the table, not because he wants Armageddon or the Third World War or the destruction of Russia, but because if he has to sit down at the table, he would rather have to say, I am negotiating with Washington and Brussels and NATO, and not this non-entity, this bug named Zelensky, who I should have stomped under my boot a lot faster. There's a lot of ways in which a NATO involvement solves a lot of Vladimir Putin's problems. And I think people arguing for no-fly zones and all kinds of other risky things should really think about that for a minute before charging in there.
So if that's true, do you think that Putin would be willing to consider the use of tactical nuclear weapons as a way of getting NATO to respond? Would he go that far? Tom?
I was waiting for Fred to save me on this.
No, Fred is going to get the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I'll respond to this too, but go ahead, Tom.
Okay.
I think that if he talks, if NATO is not involved and he talks about the use of tactical nuclear weapons, that triggers some discussions inside the Kremlin that probably could slow him down, because where would he use it? I mean, he would be targeting the people he claimed that he was denazifying and saving. And also there are some real costs for Russia just as in a physical way about things like fallout and global. I mean, he would put him at war with the entire world. And I think there would be people around him saying, even the yes men might say that, we got to think about that one a little bit. If NATO is involved, and I could very well see the argument, and I'm not saying it's a logical argument, I'm saying I could well see the discussion around the table saying, we need to bring this thing to a close and get decent terms. And that means we can show how serious we are about that by destroying a NATO base somewhere with a tactical nuclear weapon. I mean, that's in their military doctrine. Now, it depends on whether you believe their doctrine or whether it's just bluster. But I think with NATO involved, that becomes a discussion that isn't quite as off the rails and out there for the Kremlin as it would be if Putin just says, you know what, I'm tired of all this resistance in Mariupol, let's just nuke it. Because their forces are there too, and the winds blow to the east, and there's a whole bunch of other problems with it. So I think the probability of this is very low, but given Putin's state of mind, it is not zero. And I think if NATO becomes involved, very low becomes still low, but not as low as it should be. And I think, again, we need to think about that before we take those kinds of risks.
Fred?
I think that's right. Here's the sort of optimistic view. I'm not sure I fully hold this, but let me try this out.
Let's try it out, yeah.
Which is that this is a guy who came of age in the 1970s, KGB, East Germany. He would have had an understanding at that point, and in the decade or so thereafter, that of the concept of mutually assured destruction, which is, I think, as we all know, is about it basically prevents nuclear armed superpowers from going to war out of fear that what you're going to get is utter annihilation. So he would have had a sense of that. He would have been familiar with Article 5 of NATO's collective security guarantee. So this is maybe not all that optimistic in the end, but my point is that even in the bubble that he now seems to be in, as I think all three of us are agreeing, unless if he has that memory, and I have to believe that he does, and he understands what that is involved, even within that bubble, is he really going to brazenly climb some kind of nuclear escalation ladder? Probably not, which means, if I'm right about that, that the real danger is some kind of inadvertent escalation. And I have to think that the Biden people, the lights are on 24/7 in Washington because they're thinking about how to prevent that sort of thing from happening. A stray missile hits a NATO country, which I think could happen.
Which has already happened, by the way.
Oh, yeah. Well,
apparently a drone went haywire and landed in Poland.
Oh, well, so there you go. So how to respond to that kind of inadvertent escalation, I think, is going to be critically important. I'm not sure that was much of an optimistic take, but that's the best I can offer.
Well, it raises a couple interesting questions, right? First is that we kind of assume that escalation is a ladder, right? And everyone's looking at the same ladder and it's very clear on what the different steps are, right? There's X and then there's Y, and like now we're at X, and if you do Y, then. And in fact, what we realize is, especially if we think that Putin has let's call it altered view of reality right now, right? We don't know how he sees escalation, right? So for example, he had mentioned that the sanctions were equivalent to economic warfare, right? And then allegedly raised the threat readiness of his nuclear forces. And the Biden administration, as you said, was very measured, and they did not go up to DEFCON 3, right? They're like, this is just rhetoric. This is nothing to worry about. But we don't quite know what it is that NATO would do that would then trigger Putin to say, okay, now I'm really going to make them pay for this, right? It's actually quite surprising to me that he hasn't reacted more strongly to all of the military equipment filtering in from NATO into Russia. The second interesting question is that, the idea of mutually assured destruction is that you have the two superpowers looking at each other saying, the first strike will basically result in total annihilation, so we won't even bother.
Yeah.
But the fact that there is that risk of annihilation is part of what's keeping us from potentially doing more in Ukraine, right? It's a deterrence to any action, not just to a nuclear strike.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an irony here, which is worth articulating. We talked about this in my class this semester, which is that the presence of the nuclear weapons, the existence of the nuclear weapons on both sides here may keep the conflict contained, let us hope, but they also helped cause the conflict in the first place, that Putin believed, maybe rightly so, that he had a fair amount of latitude here because of the existence of a very, very large, a huge Russian nuclear arsenal. So it has that sort of ironic effect.
Can I just raise a flag for political scientists here, because we always love to tease our historian colleagues.
Yeah,
this has a name in political science, and it's called the stability-instability paradox.
Yeah.
That there's always been the worry that super stable relations at the strategic nuclear level, where everybody just assumes it's unthinkable and it can never happen, paradoxically leads powers to then say, which means I can do all kinds of mischief at anything but that level. This is something that political scientists have worked on for years and years and years, but of course our range of cases is pretty much zero. It's all speculative. But we've thought about this problem of, does that immense stability at the top then open the door to all kinds of hijinks at a lower level? The one thing I'll say about because I agree with Fred that he's not just going to wake up and one day and say, okay, that's it, I've had it. It's time to end the world. I don't, and because even in Putin's personalized regime, I'm not sure there are people who would follow that order. But I think if he has become so delusional that he believes that Ukraine was going to fall in 72 hours and that the West is decadent and weak and divided, he could believe that attacking NATO countries, and again, probably air bases because they're easy, would be something we wouldn't respond to, even if he used the nuclear weapon. He could convince himself to say, destroying some air base in Romania, or use of a nuclear weapon at sea in the Black Sea or something, that's going to bring this to a halt. I'll be a hero. The war will be over. He's a bad decision maker. I mean, this is a thing that we have to remember about Putin. He's not a good strategist. He proves it over and over again. And we keep thinking that we're trying to outmatch this chess master, when in fact, he's emotional. He's vain. He is not particularly reasonable about accepting information that he doesn't happen to like. I'm not going to say he's Saddam Hussein, but he has the same kind of problems that autocratic leaders who have lost wars have. When Saddam Hussein, right, when his advisors told him the Allies are crossing the line of departure, and he said, no, they're not. That's not happening.
Yeah. And he's been in power. When you're in power for a long time, you can begin to feel invincible. And that's when the mistakes start to creep in. Yeah.
Right.
So the question to both of you then is, what should the US and NATO do? I'm leaving the easy one for the end. Tom, you first.
Yeah. My answer, and I'll quick plug for The Atlantic because that's where I wrote it. My answer in The Atlantic was NATO should do everything it can to avoid being provoked into a rash reaction. I think even using chemical weapons, we should take a pause, He may be doing these things to try to provoke a NATO reaction so that he can shift the war away from this fiasco, this incredible bungle in Ukraine, and turn this into some kind of, glorious struggle that then he can negotiate as equals with. In the meantime, I think what we've been doing, I have to say, I don't have a lot to criticize about the Biden administration here. They're buying weapons, they're sending weapons to Ukraine, they're keeping a lid on the rhetoric. The president the other day said, "Oh, he's a thug and a murderer." I think that Fred, as old Cold War scholars, Fred and I would probably tell you that violates kind of the Cold War rules. You don't do that because eventually you're going to have a summit, meet the guy. But given what Putin's done, I don't think you're ever going to see a Western leader, not for a long time, meeting this guy and shaking his hand. So I don't know that Biden has no inner monologue about these things, and he just said it because he's Joe Biden. But I don't think it was that particularly destructive. And I think there are other people. We have contacts with the Russian government. We have allies who are in touch with the Russian government. So I think, I don't want to give you the uninteresting answer of, well, we should just keep doing more of what we're doing. But I will end that by saying, I think we should keep doing what we're doing because strategic victory is now out of Putin's reach. He can keep killing Ukrainians and trashing Ukrainian cities and blowing up apartment blocks, but his war plan has gone right down the tubes, and he is not going to get the thing he went to war for, which was to march into Kiev and do regime change. And even the terms that the Russians have been kind of floating over the past few days have let go of all that stuff. And now they're trying to focus on things like neutrality and disarmament and owning Crimea and Donbass. But all the big war aims, they're gone. And I think even Putin must know that at this. I hope, maybe I'm, knock on wood, but it seems like Putin understands this war is not this, as far as his strategic goals, he's lost this war. There's a great piece today by Elliot Cohen making the same argument. But that doesn't mean a guy who's losing a war can be more dangerous than a guy who's winning one. So I think this kind of restraint, steady support for Ukraine, keeping the temperature down on the public stuff is the right way to go.
Yeah. I think that let's just say he somehow succeeded militarily, which just seems hard for me to believe, but for the sake of argument, let's see it. Then you've got now a situation in which a country, a big country, the size of Texas, with 43 million people, 99.9% of whom are going to be, irredeemably hostile. What then, from his perspective? So I completely agree with Tom's broad take on the defeat that he's already suffered. So the question you ask is what happens next? I think, I'll refer here to history for a moment. And as you know, I'm working on the second volume of a biography of JFK. And so the missile crisis is very much on my mind. I think it does have something to potentially teach us here, because I think Kennedy understood more so than his advisors on the so-called ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, that you could not, in a nuclear age, have this thing go too far down the road. I think he decided early in the crisis that you had to have a political solution. I think it was important, I said this to a reporter the other day, that Kennedy was determined not to personalize the conflict, and also to try to show some empathetic understanding of Khrushchev's position. He told his advisors, we have to see this from the Soviet leaders' point of view, and then we have to see if there's something we can basically offer him in the way of a secret deal. And of course, that's the Jupiter, the trade for the Cuban missiles, removing the Cuban missiles in exchange for the United States removing Jupiter missiles from Turkey. And I mention that because it does seem to me that we need a ceasefire. And then at least efforts towards some kind of settlement. And I have a student in my class who knows a fair amount about these matters. And he said to me today, actually, he said that it can be helpful, he said to the class, it can be helpful to think about this in terms of a Venn diagram. And I thought that was interesting. So you see if there's a way to find a settlement that is acceptable to Kiev, to Moscow, and to Washington, or let's say to the West. So Putin's going to need something that he can sell domestically, tall order, but okay. He can control Russian media, so that gives him a certain amount of flexibility. Zelensky has, it seems to me at least, modified his position slightly with respect to potential NATO membership for Ukraine. Maybe there's some flexibility on his part. He certainly seems to suggest that there is. The West too has to get a vote in all of this. And so that's important. So a potential deal, Alexandra, I don't know if you have a thought on this, because I was trying to think about what this could look like. And we talked about this in class today. I don't know whether this would fly, but just to put something on the table here. An agreement on Ukrainian sovereignty. Second, Ukraine would pledge not to join NATO. Third, recognition that Crimea is part of Russia. And fourth, perhaps there would be some kind of referendum in the Donbass so that people there could vote on whether they would be part of Russia. Maybe several of these are non-starters, and maybe it's premature to think in these terms. But one of the problems, of course, with any kind of deal is that Putin could be perceived as being rewarded for his aggression, that it could set a bad precedent. And therefore, I think it's vitally important, as I said to my students today, that the Ukrainians have to be driving this. So it has to be their deal, if there is even a deal to be had. But look, given what we see in the horrific images we see, and what the Ukrainian people are suffering under and will continue to suffer under, I think we need to have a ceasefire, and then we need to have some kind of presumably back-channel diplomacy to see what can be had.
Can I inject one word of optimism here? This is going to be a strange word of optimism, because I think the way Fred has framed this is perfect, and that it begins with, again, the one thing that Ukraine is going to get that Putin does not, which is a sovereign Ukraine. The rest that can be bitter pills to swallow. But I really, and as a Sovietologist, I've made calls that I regret, so I probably should never predict anything. I'm a Sovietologist because my undergraduate advisor said, learn Russian. There's always going to be a Soviet Union. I think, right, Alexandra, we all, when I was a kid, back when we were over on the Yellow House on Cambridge Street, there'll always be a Soviet Union. But I am confident in saying that the high watermark of post-Soviet Russian power passed a month ago. And I don't think any of us, for a generation or two, are ever going to live with a Russia that was nearly as powerful as it was the day before Putin invaded Ukraine. And so the bitter pill here that I would tell to Zelensky is, you might have to accept some really painful things, but this regime probably is going to be around as long as you are. Now, that doesn't mean, you're going to cheat on the terms or not fulfill them or whatever it is. But I just have this sense that, the Russian military has been revealed as a paper tiger, something I never expected to see. I don't know how much long Putin's either going to be alive or in power. I wonder, I have no information about this, but I also wonder if Putin has some fear of his own mortality here that drove him to this, or that there is something about his health that drove him to it. And so, I think it would be presumptuous for me as an American to tell the Ukrainians, accept this Carthaginian peace for the sake of all that is good. But if I could be reassuring about one thing, it's that I don't think kind of like when Fred was talking earlier about the Czech Republic or Prague in 68 or Hungary in 56, to say, this isn't going to be forever. So I'm a little bit, if we survive this whole thing without it turning into a general European war or worse, then I actually think we have seen Russian power. I think Putin will be remembered as the guy who destroyed Russia at its high watermark. The Russian economy is going to be about half its size, excuse me, for years to come. I mean, he unwound 30 years of economic, political, military, diplomatic development. I mean, he crashed his own country into a ditch for no reason, for nothing. And so there's a part of me that says, I'm very much where Fred is. Get a ceasefire. Do almost anything you have to do to get a ceasefire to stop this insensate killing, and the rest is probably something you can figure out. But that, as I also agree completely with Fred, that this is a decision the Ukrainians have to make.
And in fact, that's how wars end, right? There are ceasefires, there are negotiations, there are agreements. I guess the question I struggle with is, what kind of security assurances could we or Russia give Ukraine that would be credible? Given that they already had one, right? The Budapest Memorandum of 2004, they gave up their nuclear, well, let's not call it their nuclear arsenal, but they gave up nuclear weapons in exchange for security that was going to be guaranteed by NATO and Russia. And that didn't turn out so well. Like, what could you do to really protect Ukraine?
But by a regime that was signed by a Russian regime doesn't exist anymore. And that may be the same situation that, that we find down the line, that the kind of terms the Russians want to impose may not be all that long lasting. And I don't want to be too optimistic or look too far down the road on that. I think the strongest security guarantee for Ukraine in the future is that Russian power has been dashed on the banks of the rivers around Kiev. I mean, at this point, I think the Russians are probably going to try to secure Mariupol, because that is the one thing that's still within their reach, that then gives them that sort of cohesive Crimea, land bridge, and secures that southern situation. But I think that, that Russia, even if Putin stays in power longer and has these kind of revanchist dreams of a second go, I don't think that the Russian economy or the Russian military is going to be powerful enough to try this again without resorting to, again, I hate to even bring up unconventional weapons, chemical, nuclear, whatever else, but as a conventional takeover of their neighbor, it's going to be a long time before the Russians are capable of something like this again. I think, but maybe I'm being a little too optimistic here.
All right, well, we could keep talking for a long time, but other people have questions as well. So let me present you with some of them, and we can just decide who's going to answer them. So one question here related to our point is, why can't Putin just declare victory? He can say he won, he achieved his objectives, maybe he gets that land bridge, he protects ethnic Russians, removes the military threat from Ukraine by wiping out the military industrial complex there. Who in Russia is going to say he's wrong?
Well, I mean, it could be a strategy for him to declare victory. The difficulty here, and this is where I think my concern, wells up again, is that based on what we've seen in these 4 weeks, that's just a tough argument to make. As I compare this to other military conflicts in the past, including ones that the United States has been involved with. I've done a lot of work on the Vietnam War. I think it was quite possible for Kennedy and then for Johnson at various points, and certainly for Nixon, to declare victory, even though South Vietnam had not really been secured, even though the insurgency had not really been defeated, much less North Vietnam been defeated. Mm-hmm. That was an argument that could be made. I think that's a tougher one here, Alexandra, or, in response to the question that the person posed. But it may be what Tom was suggesting is right. If he can secure the South, and they've had more success, relatively speaking, more success, it seems, in the South than elsewhere. Yeah, maybe he can hang his hat on that. He does control the media, so they'll say what they need to say to the Russian people. I don't know. It seems a pretty thin reed, but Maybe.
Well, there's two audiences he has to deal with, though. I think he could turn to, part of the problem is he boxed himself in right at the outset, right? Said, I'm going to denazify, Ukraine. And when this is over, Zelensky's still going to be there.
Yeah.
And now I think actually he can't risk killing Zelensky, because then he creates a martyr that actually makes things even worse. I mean, if Zelensky had fled or been killed, God forbid, in the first day or two, there'd probably be a different discussion about his ultimate war aims.
Completely.
But it didn't, and this is the world we're living in. So he can turn, the Russian people at this point are used to the Orwellian, we've always been at war with East Asia approach from Putin. He can turn and say, I have denazified, Zelensky is under my thumb, I have the South. His other audience, though, is he needs to be able to turn to the other guys in the Kremlin. He is not indestructible. He is a mafia don. And one thing we know about the study of mafias is the boss is in complete control right up until the moment he's not. And he needs to be able to turn to those other guys and say, this whole thing, I'm going to take out this guy and that guy and make them pay. But there are going to be people in the Kremlin who are going to say, okay, so, the guy next to me went to jail. Thousands of servicemen are dead. All this stuff. You're looking around for the traitors and asking where all the money went. And you're going to tell me that we won this thing? That he needs to have a more compelling narrative, I think, unless I'm misjudging how absolute his control inside the Kremlin is. He needs to have a better narrative for the people he works with. It's not I really appreciate that Fred brought this up earlier, that Khrushchev and Brezhnev and the rest, they had to deal with a collective leadership. Putin does not. That does not mean that he is Stalin or, Superman in Fortress of Solitude. He still has to rely on other people, and he needs them to get things done.
Yeah, and it raises Tom, to go back to the point you made earlier, he's suffered a massive strategic defeat already. So, I'm kind of left wondering, what is the argument he even makes to his Kremlin colleagues that works? I do wonder then if we come back again to some kind of back channel diplomacy that allows him to get something here, as painful as that would be for Zelensky and for others, something he can sell. But
it's probably recognition of Crimea, and because of, and for those watching, and I promise Alexandra will go right to another question, but I think for people watching, the three of us here understand why this is so, but I think it's a mystery for a lot of folks. Crimea traditionally was a part of Russia. Khrushchev, as an administrative move in 1954, just says, here's a gift to Ukraine from the people of Russia. And he puts it under Ukrainian rule. And of course, in 1991, the Ukrainians, when independence comes, the Ukrainians kind of yell, all y'all oxen free, all the borders are staying where they have to be. And the Russians are like, that seems a little dirty pool here. You've only had that since 1954. So it may well be that Crimea is the bitter pill that, as Fred says, rewards him for his aggression, but that he had anyway, that was never coming back. I don't think there was any chance of reclaiming Crimea. And he could turn to the other guys in the Kremlin and say, not only did I get this, but I got this in spite of your bungling. Because that's the other thing he's going to say.
He already had it, right? I mean,
right. But now he gets
Crimea. What he didn't have was Donetsk and Luhansk, which was allegedly the justification, right, for the initial invasion. So one of my questions is that going to be enough?
I don't know.
To make the argument.
Boy, you finally asked enough questions that I have to say.
Okay, great.
We used to say about my old boss in the Senate, he'll keep asking you a question until he gets to I don't know, and then I don't know.
We don't know. It's just, it's impossible to know. So relating to knowledge, actually, there's a question here. What kind of information are ordinary Russians getting about the war at this point? I think we've all been rather flabbergasted that the polling is showing that, in fact, support for the special military operation, which is what it's called in Russia, is increasing, if anything. Tom or Fred, you want to explain to our audience why this could be, how this could be in our modern age of technology and social media?
Tom is much more of a specialist on this. I might offer a thought or two, but you should go first, Tom.
Old Russians, as one of my friends puts it, the angry babushka demo, they were in favor of it to begin with. I mean, these are it's the Soviet generation, the people who never accepted this loss, they're in favor of it, and that's gonna grow. What's interesting is the generation coming up, the people in the cities, the younger folks, the more urbanized, many of them are leaving, but Putin's attempt to close off Russia from TikTok and Instagram and all that stuff, younger Russians know how to get around that stuff. They know what's going on. So I suspect what you're going to get is a very serious generational divide in Russia. And also the same kind of divide you see here in the United States between urban and rural, between educated and uneducated. So there will be younger people who think this is great because they think it's, I don't want to say they're the Russian Trump voters, but they're the nationalist populist folks who think it's great that Putin's out there just kicking butt, because that's what they're going to be told. What's going to undermine all of that? If the casualty figures that are leaking out today, there was a weird moment, and I'm sorry to derail everybody for a minute, but there was a weird moment where a Russian website, a pro-government Russian website, accidentally posted what looked like casualty figures. And they were astonishing. They were immense. It was like something like 19,000 killed. 20% of all US casualties in Vietnam, and they'd managed to do it in like 4 weeks. Now that website immediately went back down, and everybody kind of did a hand wave, and the Jedi mind trick, this never happened and you were never here. But that's what's going to really undermine this, in the same way that it happened. And this is probably Fred's bailiwick more than mine, but that's what happened in Afghanistan when body bags started coming in and people said, yeah, I thought we were winning this thing. And I thought, this was all going well. What's going on? So I don't think it can last.
And I think it's interesting, Tom and Alexandra, that we do have confirmation from the Russians themselves that more than a few senior mid-level officers, but also higher officers have been killed. And to me, at least, that tells you that these figures could be pretty high. It also speaks to what we know are morale problems, that these commanding officers, superior officers, feel like they have to put themselves in harm's way and are dying as a result. The question that I have for both of you, or either of you, is, how reliable is this polling?
Yeah,
I should know more about this, but if it's 79% of respondents are supportive of Russian actions, what do we know about the actual polling? I can imagine that depending on who's doing it and how they're doing it, I'm not sure we're getting honest answers from folks. But do we have a sense
totally
of
unreliable?
Yeah, I'm not sure we're getting real polling either.
But I do think that there is, in general, because of the limited information that's coming out of what's happening in Ukraine, and this responsiveness to denazification, right, is kind of the dog whistle that makes this all okay, that there is quite a lot of support for what's happening. It's not everyone, and of course there are people leaving, like the ones who object the most and have the resources are getting out of there. But I wanted to ask you, Fred, that this idea of bringing in the Nazis as an explanation for why atrocities are basically acceptable is quite stunning, right? I mean, it's making a callback to the World War II generation and this myth that Putin's relied on, but it's incredibly effective. People really believe that the country's taken over by Nazis.
Well, I mean, if you're right about that, that is an astonishing statement and a deeply worrying one, that it's working. You've got a leader in Ukraine who's Jewish, and it's just on so many levels a kind of absurd argument that's being made, and yet it's working. He clearly must have decided, and perhaps they did, maybe they did some focus group work on this, but that this was going to be a message that worked with ordinary Russians.
And not just Russians at home, right? I mean, there's soldiers that are showing up at Ukrainian doors and saying, we're here to rescue you from the Nazis. And the Ukrainians are like, what Nazis?
But it's the legitimating myth of the Russian regime going back even to the Soviet times, that for all these deprivations we've put you through, for all this misery, we saved you and the world from the Nazis.
Yes.
And so it's the only, even now, I mean, you know, the way that military cemeteries are, you know, venerated. I mean, Putin, this goes back to Fred's point about the 70s. You know, Putin comes up in that generation where World War II explains everything.
Yeah.
But I want to add to that, you know, our earlier conversation, Alexandra, NATO is one of those visceral words as well that just sends a jolt right through, you know, even younger Russians who just don't really have any experience of the Cold War. For them, it's still a word that the regime over the years has just held on to and propagandized, so that when you say the word NATO, it still sends a kind of an electric zing through a lot of Russians. And that's one of the things that really worries me about our involvement.
Yeah, it is. I was going to say this earlier. It is a four-letter word, and among a great number of people, including in the younger generation, as you say.
So on a totally different topic, somebody is asking, why haven't we seen cyber attacks? We were all expecting them.
The
right?
day's not over.
Okay, but like that was perceived to be, you know, something that was likely. And now it seems everyone partially realizes the risk of escalation, but is something happening behind the scenes and we just don't see it? Or is that too risky even for the Russians?
Well, this is where I have to remind people that even though I'm retiring in 10 days, I still don't represent the US government.
Thank you.
I'd be so glad that I never have to say that again. I think one thing Americans should be happy about is that we expected it and we hardened our systems for it, and the Russians knew it. So, you know, the Biden administration was not, no matter what else you may think about the Biden administration, they were not caught flat-footed by this. And I think that their willingness to share intelligence and put it out in public blunted a lot of these possibilities. But I would remind people, I was only partly kidding when I said the day's not over yet. Just before we started this, the Biden administration came out and said, brace yourselves for what is now going to be a wave of cyber attacks that are probably coming. And again, I think the Russians didn't prepare this because they somehow got it into their head. And Fred, being the military historian, can talk more about strategic surprise. I think, Fred, they got it into their head that if we don't have a wave of cyber attacks, we can still maintain operational surprise about what day we're going to go and how we're going to do this. And we won't alert the whole West and light up all of their systems with cyber attacks. And then, you know, we'll just not do this because it's going to end quickly. And now that the sanctions, I mean, I really think they were caught by surprise on this, about all the sanctions, about the Western unity. They were thinking they could play us by not overwhelming our cyber infrastructure, and they held off of it. And now I guess they just don't have anything else to lose.
No, I think that was the point I was going to make, is that, again, a 72-hour operation, you know, maybe a little bit longer than that, but this is going to be a kind of cakewalk. And that, I think, is what they assumed. I also just want to underscore something Tom mentioned, which we haven't discussed, but the decision by the Biden administration to disclose this intelligence, as you'll remember, all of you, really going back probably a couple months before the invasion began, and people were saying, why are they doing this? And I think it proved to be hugely important. It took away from Putin any number of pretexts that he could have used to try to make this easier. I think it probably certainly influenced how the administration responded, but also Ukrainians responded, NATO. At least at this point, it's hard for me, Alexandra, to criticize that particular decision by the administration to put all this out there when they did.
I think it's going to be remembered as one of the best things they did.
Yeah. So that leads me to something I've been thinking about that relates to the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, Kennedy and Khrushchev had 13 days to resolve this conflict, right? Yeah. And now we have 3 minutes, maybe, in case of some of these potential cyber attacks, or some of the hypersonic missiles. I guess it's under 3 seconds, or however fast they fly. Like, do you think the compressed amount of time that leaders have for decision making and for thinking about an appropriate response is somehow affecting the ability to find a compromise, to find those off ramps, to help resolve the conflict in a way that previous leaders like Kennedy and Khrushchev didn't have to worry about?
Potentially. I think it may be more compressed, or at least it has the possibility of becoming more compressed. On the other hand, I think we could say that the key moments in the missile crisis, and I'm just going through the tapes now, basically, and the transcripts and trying to figure out what happened when. It's a relatively short period of time when the crisis basically pivots, and it's not a lot of time. Lots of opportunities for miscommunication, and of course, we came closer, I think we now know, to a nuclear catastrophe in October '62 than we thought even at the time. And it would seem to me, knock on wood, that even today, Alexandra, there are opportunities here for how long, who knows? But there are opportunities, I think, to look for those off-ramps, as you put it, to find them. I have to think lots of smart people in the administration and in other Western capitals are thinking about those alternatives. Perhaps there's already been some kind of back channel approaches to the Kremlin. I don't know, but so I guess it's a long way of saying that I'm not sure that there's as much of a distinction between the missile crisis and where we find ourselves now in that temporal dimension in terms of how much time we have to figure something out.
Sorry, Fred, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No,
can I throw in the idea here that what's changed and made the world more dangerous in a crisis like this is not the military technology, it's the information technology. And I think, and this is where I'm going to do my grandpa act and talk to younger people in the audience.
You're retiring, you're allowed.
Say, you kids today don't understand. But Fred, in studying the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'm sure you can even see this in the transcripts that I know you and I have both looked at. The inability to constantly be in contact and take in information enforce these kind of 8 to 10 hour pauses in the rhythm of the two governments, so that the public reaction was always dovetailed with the morning paper or the evening news or the evening paper. And that was it. There wasn't this ability to sit. I mean, I'm trying to think of, I'm kind of curious what Fred thinks about this. Imagine if you had a Cuban Missile Crisis where there were just drones flying over Cuba all day long for 13 days, watching Soviet construction battalions putting up SAM sites. Would we, in a way, kind of blanking out the news, disconnecting from the international situation, having to wait for information and confirmation of things on both sides, enforce these moments where in the White House, they could sort of sit back and say, okay, so nothing's going to happen for the next 2 hours until we hear from the, from the guy in the U-2 plane, and we can all just, calm down for a minute. There is no moment of pause in the modern crisis environment. And that scares me, because in Kennedy's day, they still had to worry about submarines launching from the Atlantic and taking out the White House in 8 minutes. I mean, that's no different than now. But what they couldn't do was just say, we have some moments of quiet here where we're not going to talk to them. They don't have to talk to us. No one really knows what's going on. We can sort of digest this for a moment. We don't get that anymore in the 21st century. Everything is instant.
I think it's a really good point, and I should revise, in a sense, my answer to Alexandra, because I do think you're putting your finger on something, Tom, that I think matters. I mean, during the missile crisis, Kennedy and his team could say, "Yeah, no, I'm going to take that campaign trip, so that people don't have a sense that something is wrong. We're going to pretend here that there's nothing really serious going on here," and it worked. And as Tom says, you could have half a day, sometimes maybe even more than that, to really figure out what your next step is. You're quite right that we've lost that. Maybe not fully, to go back to my previous answer. I think there's still, and the fact that they're anticipating this and talking about this, I think, continuously should help, but no question, really important difference between then and now.
For younger people, let me explain to you the notion that you had to develop film. right? So you flew an airplane.
Okay, Grandpa.
You flew an airplane over
wanna...
these sites, and then you had to take a can and take it to a lab and develop the film and send it to the CIA. And that actually, all kidding aside, that actually enforced just a moment where you'd say, well, until we see the film and until we can sit down and look at the pictures, we have nothing to react to, as opposed to this constant sensory stream coming in from, I'm amazed at the satellite photographs. I was going to add that one more thing about the satellite photographs during Cuba. As Fred, we all know, those were the most classified things in the world. Now you have Maxar up saying, well, here's the battlefield 6 minutes ago.
And apparently the resolution is much better than even in 2014, right?
Oh yeah, it's amazing.
Huh.
Amazing.
The thing about technology though, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying, is, look at how Zelensky is crushing it, right? In terms of rallying his population and the international community. And obviously he's an excellent communicator. He has incredible, charisma and skills. But if technology weren't where it was today, would he be able to be driving the resistance the way he is?
No, I don't think he could. I mean, I think it's remarkable the degree to which in real time, the whole world can see him in that t-shirt or that sweater, looking the way he looks and speaking in a way that has just galvanized people, not only in his own country, but elsewhere. And so I think your point is really well taken. That is not something that would have been possible even a few years ago. But his own, as we've been saying tonight, he matters in all of this. This guy who played a president in a TV series, a stand-up comedian, has shown himself completely equal to the moment. Whatever he might, do from here on out, and I'm sure he'll make mistakes. I have just been blown away by what he's been able to do.
But he's also been surrounded by, clearly, at least when it comes to the information war, he's been surrounded by a good team, because the kind of things you're talking about, Alexandra, about TikTok and Instagram and these things that didn't exist before, you still have to be able to know how to use them. And what's really struck me is how deftly the Ukrainians have completely outplayed the Russians on this. The Russians used to be really good at this, especially in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And Putin had a really great PR kind of comms operation going. And I think what it really shows you, if there's a bigger point in all of this, is that a democracy full of motivated, tech-savvy young people can outplay, at least in the information space, can outplay an authoritarian system led by a dictator with a bunch of people that are paranoid about any misstep in public, because it could be the end of their career or even worse. And what you really see if you watch Russian TV these days, it really has devolved to kind of a stupid, glitzy, substance-free, game show environment. And I think the reason for that is partly because of their intended audience for the message, but also because it's safe. That's the safest way to deliver those messages without a misstep. Whereas Zelensky's team has been daring and creative and really just out there in the information war.
So there are a lot more questions that we're not going to get to, but I want to make sure that we end and talk about the Ukrainian people, right? Because it's not just Zelensky that's making, an incredible difference and sort of the David against the Goliath, but the Ukrainian people and what they're doing in terms of military resistance, in terms of social cohesion, unity, has really, I think, taken a lot of people by surprise, especially given that we've been talking about sort of the demise of democracy and, the weaknesses of various democratic systems. I mean, what has surprised you most in terms of what you've seen amidst the population in Ukraine?
Well, I'll
go. Yeah,
I'll steal again. I'm going to steal a thought from a smarter writer, from Anne Applebaum about this, who said it's interesting that what Putin feared was a nationalist Ukraine, and I feared it too, because I'm deeply suspicious of nationalism in that very blood and soil way. But the nationalism that seems to have erupted in Ukraine now is a civic nationalism. that is based on the idea of statehood and independence and a Ukrainian state that isn't necessarily tied to an ethnic Ukrainian identity. And it's evidence again to me that the Russians deeply misjudged the people they were going up against. And thought of them as, sort of, at one point, Putin uses the term Banderites, which is like right? I mean, it's World War II kind of post-war, slagging of Ukrainian nationalism. And instead, you've got people who are literally saying, okay, I live here. I don't have anywhere to go. This is my country. I'm not leaving. Even though there's this terrible refugee crisis, you have people just saying, well, I'm going to pick up a gun and I'm going to fight. And they're not fighting because it's their DNA calling to them, which I think Putin more or less expected, but rather it's saying, no, this flag means something. This place I live means something. That has surprised me in a very positive way. And I think it surprised Putin in a really bad way.
Yeah, I mean, consider the just the immense irony of this, that, he felt, and I guess still feels, that Ukraine must be part of Russia and that it is part of Russia. And what we've seen over the last 4 weeks is, a conviction on the part of people that, no, that's precisely what we're not and we're never going to be. I just find that absolutely astonishing. I think your question, Alexandra, what has surprised me the most? That's such a good question. I guess on a very basic level, that so many Ukrainians, even understanding the immensity of Russian military power, at least the brute force of that military power, potentially, are not only staying, but are fighting. And that includes a lot of women who have decided that, they're going to take up arms here to defend their towns and their cities. I guess I didn't expect to see that, given again the overwhelming superiority in numbers and in sheer firepower that the Russians bring to the battlefield. That has been just something to see. Again, I keep coming back to Zelensky. The counterfactual is interesting. If he's not in the picture, do we see Ukrainians doing this? Perhaps. But I think it's Zelensky working with, as Tom says, a superb team around him. And by the way, we haven't talked about their military capabilities. I think both at the command level and below, they're performing, at least at this point, incredibly well. And then, as we're saying, ordinary Ukrainians, it's been something to see.
And this terrible refugee crisis, the biggest refugee crisis since World War II, 10 million people displaced, many of them going into Eastern European countries, some into Moldova. Is the West, is Europe going to be able to cope with this crisis? They didn't do such a good job with other refugee crises, with Syrians, with Afghanistan.
But what a welcome surprise for us, and what an unwelcome surprise for Putin, because a lot of Putin's thinking, I think, internalized a lot of the kind of right-wing nationalist critiques in the United States and Europe that, when moments like this come, people throw up their borders and they take care of their own, and international institutions are all, fraud, and nobody cares about these things, and globalization is a sham. And yet, in the middle of this refugee crisis, what Putin finds out is Europeans are saying, we're Europeans. Suddenly, wow, it suddenly matters. And institutions like the European Union suddenly have meaning to us. And globalization allows us to absorb this and move money and people around, as well as, we talked about the economic warfare earlier. If you didn't think globalization was important, being able to turn out the lights on the Russian economy in about 96 hours tells you that these institutions really matter. And so I think, once again, that Putin and the people around him bought into this crackpot idea that when push came to shove, Poles and Moldovans and other, we would never take in these people, and national borders matter the most, and nobody would ever do it. And suddenly they're finding out that they tried to launch this 19th century war of conquest in a very 21st century Europe.
Yeah, I think we've talked
That
about
was the optimistic conclusion that we're looking for, Fred. Build
well,
on this.
so I mean,
Don't ruin the moment, Fred.
No, I'm not going to. I'm not going to. Trust me. I think we've talked about, 10 or 12 different miscalculations by Putin. This one that Tom so eloquently has just spoken to, this is maybe the most amazing one. Well, it's among the more amazing one of them all, that this has been the response in these neighboring countries, including some, frankly, that I thought would have been a little more, have more reservations about this. 6 months down the road, will things be different? Who knows? But I think it's been a marvelous thing. I think it's great that 10 days before his retirement, we got Tom to appear, and best of luck as you sail off into the sunset and write all kinds of
I don't
books.
think he's sailing quietly.
Yeah, I'm not-
I think we're going to
No, just in terms of his
You're
teaching.
not getting rid of me that easy, but
Just in terms of his endless committee meetings, which I know a lot about, teaching, which can be great, but no, the
I'm
fun
already
really now
deleting
begins.
a lot of emails. Yes. But I'll be around. But at least the next time I join you, I won't have to say, please remember, I don't speak for the government of the United States. And I'll just be just another guy throwing his opinions out there.
Well, Tom Nichols, Fred Logevall are incredibly large and well-informed audience members. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been a great discussion. And I really appreciate learning so much from both of you.
Thank you, Alexandra, for walking us through it.